You're watching CNBC Africa, and this is the intersection of money and power. I am Karabole Tlatla. This is Political Capital. They were formed in 2013, and a year later, they received 6.35% of the national vote. According to polls like the Institute of Race Relations, the Economic Freedom Fighters is expected to double to about 11% of the national votes in 2019. On this show, we interrogate just that following the launch of its election manifesto. Later in the show, names continue to be dropped at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. We'll give you some of today's highlights. And last but not least, we check in with the mining indaba currently taking place in the mother city. But first, Julius Malema and his Red Beret Brigade launched their second party manifesto ahead of the national elections this May. They packed the Soshanguve Giant Stadium and rose to a crescendo. But outside of the captive audience, did Julius Malema win over any other constituency? Let's check out this report. The race for your vote is on. South Africa's third largest party, an unpredictable headache for its two largest rivals. One's Your Vote. With a delayed start, the Economic Freedom Fighters launched its election plan supported by friends and celebrities. 2019 marks the 5th year of existence for the Economic Freedom Fighters, and it is still hard to separate its leader's cult-like status with genuine support for the party. But that wasn't a worry for today. Numbers were.
All mine workers, the entry level must be 12,500 for all the mine workers who are at an entry level. The farm workers, 5,000. Manufacturing workers, 6,500. Retail workers, 5,000. Builders will earn a salary of 7,000. Petrol attendants, 6,500. Cleaners, 4,500. Domestic workers, 5,000. Security guards, 7,500. Waiters and waitresses, 4,500.
The EFF won 6.35% of the national vote in its first elections in 2014. Fast forward 5 years, much like the ruling ANC and its opposition, the DA, it is under a varying degree of pressure to grow its own numbers. But with the ANC's dirty laundry being broadcast through the State Capture Inquiry and the DA's continued internal problems, is Malema hitting the right notes with a growing number of disenfranchised young people like those here in Soshanguve and beyond?
So much has happened for such a young political party. They've proven themselves to be, a force to be reckoned with in the political space. So they are a party to really consider as an alternative, to the usual, of course.
He's talking about substantial increases. I think it's going to be a hard one, but I think over long term, it's possible that he can achieve it. So not in the next year. In a long run.
Most of the promises, I just think like most politicians, are empty, especially this time of the elections coming up. They just want to tell people what they want to hear right now. I think a lot of parties are like that, and you have to think before you vote and make sure you vote for the right party.
Some argue the EFF's politics are too radical to attract a majority centrist population, and while half of the promises made on Saturday have no basis in economic reality, the EFF knows it is just rhetoric.
Corporate tax, meaning tax ya di company. So ya lena re shefase. Re nyaka o reduce le VAT to 14% from 15%. Because ebolaya batho ba o sokola. Re nyaka inheritance tax e odimo. Inheritance tax ke lwetjela batho ba di kirang bo papa bona le bo mao bona ba khwile mara ke bo mang batho ba kirang dilo tšeo ke the rich lena le kere selo ka inherita mokhukhu.
But the party has surprised before and could do it again. The only thing that's certain is that the race for your vote is on. Joining me now for this discussion on the economics of the EFF election manifesto and its politics is Richard Cullen, who is the Associate Professor in Public Law at UCT and a partner at Paternoster Group. Also joining us is Kealeboga Maphunye, who is a Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria. Gentlemen, for your time, I thank you both. How much of what we heard Julius Malema say during the weekend is just plain politics? Because some say that a lot of the EFF manifesto is not based on economic realities.
Well, the economic freedom fighters have a very attractive value proposition politically. Their value proposition, ever since their foundation a few years ago, has been basically that South Africa has had 25 years of democratic freedom, but not enough economic freedom. And of course, that reflects, I think, the reality of South Africa, which is that it's a country with high unemployment, high levels of inequality, and unacceptable concentrations of resources and oligopolies of power. So their value proposition is an attractive one, but they are a single-digit political party. They won 6% in 2014, and more or less the same amount at the 2016 local government elections. So this election in 2019 is a watershed election for the EFF. They have to turn that value proposition into real votes. They have to show the people of South Africa that they have serious answers to these difficult problems. And in a sense, this poll is a measure or a poll about South Africa's appetite for this kind of militant form of politics.
Professor Cullen, are you saying that you do not agree with the Institute of Race Relations, which expect the EFF to be at about 11% following the elections this year?
I think that my own view is that the EFF will do well to reach double digit. There's very little evidence at the moment that they can do much better than that. But whether it's 9% or 10%, they will remain a small party. And I think that for them to have a long-term future, and for Malema, Julius Malema, their leader, to remain engaged in politics with appetite and enthusiasm, he is a power-hungry individual. He's interested in power. Let's be clear about that. And I think that if he wakes up on the morning after our national election in May with just 10% or even 11% of the vote, I think his appetite will quickly dwindle, and I think the EFF will start to slowly evaporate as a serious political force within our politics.
All right, let's bring in Professor Maphunye. Prof, the EFF is definitely playing what would be considered music to a captive audience, which is by large means not necessarily the haves. They would be the have-nots. But they're saying they're making all the right noises. They're saying they would increase corporate tax to 32%. They would increase dividend tax to 25%. They would also increase inheritance tax. Surely that should improve their voter base.
I am inclined to believe that absolutely the EFF is making the right noises to its constituency. We saw in the previous elections in 2014, whenever they have these manifesto launches throughout the country. I attended one in Tembisa, and it was massive. And at that time, based on the noises that they were making, as well as the fact that that was the first, major election in which they participated. Many people, even us commentators, scholars, analysts, thought that the EFF would, get a much more bigger margin than the 6% that they got eventually in 2016. So I tend to be more on the conservative side. You talk about double digit, where will it have double digit? I'm a bit skeptical. Well, there is a possibility that one cannot write off at this stage between now and the date of the election. So much can happen, especially for those swinging voters.
Let me bring back Professor Cullen. Professor Cullen, When you looked at this year's manifesto of the economic freedom fighters, I mean, I argue that I was at Soshanguve during the weekend, and I still cannot tell how much the EFF enjoys support as a party, or how much of the people that I saw there are there as a result of the cult-like status of Julius Malema. But I was really surprised at the fact that it wasn't just land that formed the basis of the manifesto, if you will. It's jobs too. Does that really infer the growing base within the EFF and how much it's contributing to the election manifesto?
The EFF have had to diversify their electoral offering. The reason being that, first of all, Jacob Zuma has gone, and for 2 or 3 years, the essential attack mode of the EFF was to attack Jacob Zuma because of his corrupt brand and because he was vulnerable. He's gone, of course. Then they took on the land issue as being a classic populist issue in which they could make grand promises of nationalizing land and taking government ownership of land without any real understanding of the fiscal or investment or growth consequences of such a policy. But the ANC and Cyril Ramaphosa, the ANC and the government president, of course, have played their cards reasonably well in respect of land. The ANC have taken on expropriation without compensation, and in a sense, they have taken the rug from underneath the EFF on that issue. So the EFF has to search for new issues, and jobs, I think, is understandably their preoccupation now, because unemployment rates, especially amongst young people, 52% of young South Africans are unemployed. There is a market there. But one last point, Kealeboga, and that's this. Their market, as Professor Maphunye put it, is a young potential target market. But the fact of the matter is a lot of young voters have not registered to vote. So if they're not registered, they can't actually vote, obviously. And that's, I think, a tactical problem for the EFF.
Let me bring in Professor Maphunye. Professor, I mean, part of the captive audience that the EFF enjoys is the fact that, you know, they seem to pull in a lot of disenfranchised youth who still feel the effect of economic apartheid today. There's people on the margins which relate to the EFF. So my real question is, as the South African economy continues to leave more and more people on the margins, why shouldn't Julius Malema really become president of South Africa? Because to me, it looks like his voter base keeps increasing.
He comes from the same stable, such as the very people that he has been criticizing, including Jacob Zuma, whom, as Professor Cullen mentioned, is not on. And secondly, also this issue of rhetoric that frightens some of the prospective voters, including the very rowdy, type of, politics that the EFF do engage in, especially in my view, the very fact that when I just looked at their manifesto, one of the pillars that with 7 pillars in their manifesto, I was expecting the word democracy to appear there, but it's not appearing. They talk about an open society, and for me, it makes the whole thing fuzzy as to whether is this party actually hiding its dictatorial tendencies or the dictatorial tendencies of the leadership. And then finally, in my view, as Professor Cullen mentioned earlier, and I concur with him absolutely, because this is what I noticed in 2014 in Tembisa when I was observing that rally. Not many of these people who are mobbing the EFF at each and every one of its launches, manifesto launches, are registered. The majority of them are very poor. They are very disgruntled. They haven't gone through the process to register with the IEC. And to that extent, this is why I don't think we'll wake up with the Julius Malema presidency tomorrow, come 2019 in May.
Let's wrap things up with Professor Cullen. Now, Richard, part of the EFF's manifesto was not new. The fight on land remains the same, even though what would be their coalition partner on this, the African National Congress, does not exactly share the principle of nationalizing land. But how far do you think the election machinery can go on the emotive issue that is land? And is land really the first priority for disenfranchised South Africans?
What's interesting, Kealeboga, and it's a very good question you posed, is that all of the opinion polling of the last 20 years, and even the opinion polling of the Institute for Race Relations more recently, shows that land as a policy issue sits very low in the list of priorities of ordinary South Africans. When we used to poll at IDASA 15, 20 years ago, it never got more than 1% from people saying it was the number one priority. In more recent times, the IRR poll you referred to earlier, the figure had increased to 17%, but it's still only 17%. I think the truth is, what matters to ordinary South Africans is jobs, security, public education, and health. And the question is, does the EFF have a better, a sounder value proposition in terms of policy than the ANC? And lastly, this election, Kealeboga, is about trust. Is Cyril Ramaphosa trustworthy? Will people trust him, even though it means voting for the ANC, who gave us Jacob Zuma, who tolerated and enabled Jacob Zuma? Or will they trust a militant populist like Julius Malema, who, as Professor Maphunye puts it very well, essentially runs a very autocratic party and is a kind of demagogic populist leader of the sort that we've seen emerge throughout much of the democratic world. This is a poll about trust, but it's also a poll about populism and whether South Africa has an appetite for populism or not.
All right, I'd like to thank both my guests on Skype, Richard Cullen, who is an associate professor of law at UCT and partner at Paternoster Group, as well as Kealeboga Maphunye, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of South Africa. Stay tuned to the show. When we come back, we highlight some of the testimony you heard today at the State Capture Inquiry.